The broken family's desperate search the haunted mansion. Autumn rain drummed against the towering windows of the Mitchell mansion, each droplet seeming to echo the sorrow that had settled over the grand estate like a heavy blanket. James Mitchell stood in his home office, staring blankly at financial reports that blurred together on his computer screen. At 38, he had built Mitchell Industries from the ground up, creating a tech empire that revolutionized data security. But all his success felt meaningless now. 6 months after losing his wife, Rachel, in a devastating car accident, the mansion that once rang with laughter and warmth had become a fortress of grief. Rachel's presence still lingered everywhere, in the fresh flowers she loved that now withered untended, in the family photos lining the hallways, and most painfully, in their 7-year-old twin sons, Oliver and Benjamin, who bore her bright green eyes and infectious smile. James rubbed his tired eyes, the dark circles beneath them telling the story of countless sleepless nights. The twins had not slept through a single night since their mother's funeral. Every evening at precisely midnight, their terrified screams would pierce the silence, sending James racing down the marble corridors to find them huddled together, trembling and sobbing about the dark lady who visited their dreams. The parade of failed caregivers. Margaret Harrison, the city's most renowned child psychologist, had been the first to try helping the boys. With her impressive credentials and confident demeanor, she had assured James that trauma therapy and mild sedatives would solve the problem. But after 3 weeks of sessions and no improvement, she admitted defeat, leaving behind only hefty bills and more confusion. Next came Victoria Sterling, a nanny with 20 years of experience caring for wealthy families. She arrived with glowing references and a known-and-sense attitude, declaring she would have the boys sleeping peacefully within a week. 3 days later, she packed her bags, her usual composure shattered after witnessing one of the twins' midnight episodes. "Mr. Mitchell," she had said, her hand shaking as she gathered her belongings, "in all my years, I've never encountered anything like this. Those children need more help than I can provide." The pattern continued with heartbreaking regularity. Isabella Rodriguez, a former pediatric nurse with specialized training in childhood trauma, lasted 5 days. Catherine Webb, who held a master's degree in child development, managed only a week before requesting an early release from her contract. Each failure deepened James's despair and the twins' mistrust of new faces. Oliver, once an outgoing child, who loved building elaborate castle structures, now barely spoke above a whisper. Benjamin, who had inherited his mother's artistic talents, refused to pick up his beloved colored pencils. They clung to each other like survivors of a shipwreck, their young faces etched with fear and loss that no child should bear. A father's breaking point, James's business began to suffer under the weight of his personal crisis. Board meetings were missed, important decisions delayed, and his usually sharp focus dulled by exhaustion. His assistant, Mrs. Chen, gently suggested he take extended leave, but James couldn't bear the thought of being idle while his sons suffered. One particularly difficult morning, after both boys had spent the night in his bed following another nightmare episode, James sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. The untouched breakfast plates before him seemed to mock his inability to provide the comfort his children desperately needed. "Daddy," Oliver whispered, tugging at his sleeve with small, cold fingers, "when is the dark lady going to stop coming?" Benjamin nodded solemnly beside his brother, his green eyes so much like Rachel's, filled with a fear that broke James's heart anew. "She keeps trying to take us away, like she took Mummy." James pulled both boys into his arms, feeling their fragile bodies shake against his chest. He had run out of answers, out of hope, and nearly out of strength. That afternoon, he made one final call to the placement agency, his voice hoarse with desperation. "I need someone different," he told the agency director. "Not another specialist or expert, just someone who genuinely cares about children, someone who won't give up." Emma's arrival 3 days later, on a gray October afternoon, the doorbell chimed through the mansion's vast halls. James opened the heavy oak door to find a young woman standing on his doorstep, a worn leather bag slung over her shoulder and a gentle smile on her face despite the cold drizzle. Emma Walsh appeared to be in her late 20s, with chestnut hair that caught the light and warm brown eyes that seemed to radiate kindness. Her simple blue dress and practical flat shoes were a stark contrast to the polished professional attire of previous candidates. There was something refreshingly authentic about her, an absence of the clinical detachment he had grown accustomed to from other caregivers. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice soft but confident. "I'm Emma Walsh. I apologize for being a few minutes late." I stopped to help an elderly gentleman who had dropped his groceries. James invited her into the sitting room, where afternoon light filtered through tall windows overlooking Rachel's rose garden. Emma's resume was modest compared to the others: a degree in elementary education from a state university, several years working at a children's shelter, and references that spoke more of her heart than her credentials. "Miss Walsh," James began, his tone guarded after so many disappointments, "I should be honest with you. My sons have been through significant trauma, and they've rejected every caregiver we've tried. Their situation is ... challenging." Emma listened intently, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished explaining the midnight terrors and the parade of failed attempts to help, she was quiet for a long moment, seemingly lost in thought. "Mr. Mitchell," she finally said, "I won't pretend to have all the answers or promise quick solutions, but I believe every child has the capacity to heal, given enough patience and genuine care. Sometimes the simplest approaches are the most effective." Before James could respond, small footsteps echoed in the hallway. Oliver and Benjamin appeared in the doorway, their identical faces peering around the frame with curious but wary expressions. For months, they had learned to associate new adults with disappointment and abandonment. Emma turned toward them slowly, making no sudden movements. Instead of the usual adult approach of immediate friendliness or professional assessment, she simply smiled and said, "Hello there, I'm Emma. I was just admiring the beautiful drawings on the refrigerator. Are those your artwork?" Benjamin's eyes widened slightly. No one had mentioned his drawings in months. Oliver stepped protectively closer to his brother but didn't retreat. "I used to love drawing castles when I was your age," Emma continued conversationally, "though I was never very good at making the towers straight. Do you think you could show me some techniques sometime?" The twins exchanged a look, their first sign of interest in weeks. James watched in amazement as his sons, who had barely acknowledged the previous candidates, took tentative steps into the room. "Maybe," Benjamin whispered, his voice barely audible. Emma's smile brightened, but she didn't push. Instead, she turned back to James. "Would it be possible for me to start tomorrow? I believe Oliver and Benjamin might benefit from consistency, and I'm eager to begin." As the twins listened from their spot by the window, James felt the first flutter of hope he had experienced in months. There was something different about Emma Walsh, something that went beyond credentials and experience. Perhaps, just perhaps, she might be the answer to their prayers. That evening, for the first time since Rachel's death, Oliver asked a question about tomorrow instead of expressing fear about the coming night. It was a small sign, but in the Mitchell household, small signs had become precious gifts of hope. Hearts mending through gentle care. Ma's first night. Emma arrived at the Mitchell mansion the next morning carrying a simple canvas bag filled with what she called her magic tools: colored pencils, sheets of blank paper, a small collection of smooth river stones, and a worn children's book about friendship. Unlike the previous caregivers who had brought medical equipment and behavioral charts, Emma's approach was refreshingly simple. James watched from his office window as Emma sat cross-legged on the living room carpet with Oliver and Benjamin. She didn't force conversation or impose structured activities. Instead, she quietly began sketching on a piece of paper, humming softly to herself. Within minutes, the twins had crept closer, their natural curiosity overcoming their usual wariness. "What are you drawing?" Oliver asked, his voice still tentative but clearly interested. Emma looked up with a warm smile. "I'm not quite sure yet. Sometimes the best drawings happen when you let your hand decide. Would you like to help me figure out what it wants to become?" Benjamin nodded eagerly, picking up a colored pencil for the first time in months. As the morning progressed, Emma guided them through what she called imagination time, creating stories about the shapes and colors that emerged on their shared canvas. There were no rules, no right or wrong answers, just pure creative expression. By lunch, both boys were laughing at Emma's silly voices for the characters they had drawn together. James felt his chest tighten with a mixture of hope and fear. Could it really be this simple? Could the healing his sons needed come through something as basic as drawing and storytelling? The midnight test, the true test, came that night. James lay awake in his bed, listening for the familiar sounds of distress that had haunted their home for months. As the clock approached midnight, he held his breath, waiting for the inevitable screams. Instead, he heard something extraordinary: Emma's gentle voice drifting from the twins' bedroom, telling a story about two brave knights who protected their kingdom from shadow monsters using shields made of starlight. When Oliver's frightened whimper interrupted the tale, Emma's voice remained calm and soothing. "The shadow can't hurt you, Oliver, because you have something more powerful than it does," she whispered. "You have love, your daddy's love, your brother's love, and your mummy's love that will always live in your heart. That love is stronger than any darkness." James found himself creeping down the hallway, drawn by the peaceful scene. Through the cracked door, he could see Emma sitting between the twins' beds, her hand gently stroking Oliver's hair while Benjamin listened with wide, trusting eyes. For the first time in 6 months, the boys weren't trembling with terror at midnight. "Miss Emma," Benjamin whispered, "do you think Mummy can see us from heaven?" Emma's voice was tender as she replied, "I believe she can, sweetheart. And I think she's very proud of how brave you and Oliver are being. When we love someone, that love never really goes away, it just changes form, like water becoming a cloud or a snowflake." James felt tears he had been holding back for months finally begin to fall. This young woman, with no fancy degrees or expensive treatments, was giving his sons something no one else had been able to provide: genuine comfort and hope. Growing connections over the following weeks. Emma worked her quiet magic throughout the Mitchell household. She established gentle routines that gave the boys security without feeling restrictive. Morning art sessions were followed by outdoor exploration in the mansion's gardens, where Emma taught them to find shapes in clouds and listen to the stories that trees might tell. She never spoke negatively about their fears or tried to dismiss their grief. Instead, she helped them understand that missing their mother was natural and that being sad sometimes was okay. She created what she called memory moments, special times when the boys could share favorite stories about Rachel without fear of making their father cry. James found himself looking forward to these glimpses into his son's healing process. Emma had a gift for making even the most difficult conversations feel safe and manageable. When Benjamin asked why God had taken their mummy away, Emma didn't offer empty platitudes or complex explanations. Instead, she said, "Sometimes sad things happen that we can't understand, but that doesn't mean we're alone. We have each other, and that's something beautiful." The father's healing as his sons began to flourish under Emma's care, James realized he was changing too. The constant knot of anxiety in his chest had begun to loosen. He started sleeping through the night again, waking to the sound of laughter instead of screams. His work performance improved, and for the first time since Rachel's death, he could think about the future without overwhelming dread. Emma had a way of including him in the healing process without making him feel judged for his previous struggles. She would share small victories from the day Oliver had gone 5 minutes without checking to make sure she was still there, or Benjamin had mentioned a happy memory about his mother without crying. These updates weren't clinical reports, but gentle celebrations of progress. One evening, as James helped Emma clean up after a particularly enthusiastic art session, their hands touched briefly while reaching for the same crayon. The simple contact sent an unexpected warmth through him, not the desperate need for comfort he had felt in his darkest moments, but something deeper and more hopeful. "Emma," he said softly, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've given us. You've brought my sons back to life." Emma's cheeks flushed pink as she met his gaze. "They were never really gone, James. They just needed someone to remind them that it was safe to be children again." The use of his first name, spoken with such gentle affection, made James's heart skip. For the first time since Rachel's death, he allowed himself to truly see Emma not just as his children's caregiver, but as a remarkable woman who had become essential to their family's happiness. Love emerging from healing, shift from gratitude to deeper affection happened gradually, like sunrise slowly painting the sky. James began finding excuses to spend time with Emma after the boys were asleep, sharing stories about his work or asking about her past. He learned that she had grown up in foster care, that her love for children came from understanding what it felt like to be lost and afraid. "I never had a family of my own," Emma confided one evening as they sat in the garden under a blanket of stars. "But being here with you and the boys, it feels like coming home for the first time." James reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers as naturally as breathing. "Emma, you are family now. You've saved us in ways I never thought possible." When Emma looked up at him, her brown eyes reflecting the moonlight, James felt something he thought he'd never experience again: the stirring of genuine love. It wasn't a betrayal of Rachel's memory, but rather a testament to the healing Emma had brought to all their lives. A new beginning 3 months after Emma's arrival. The Mitchell mansion had transformed into a true home again. The boys no longer woke in terror but occasionally padded into James's room for morning snuggles, sharing dreams about flying castles and friendly dragons. Their laughter echoed through halls that had been silent for too long. On a snowy December evening, as Emma tucked the twins into bed, Oliver asked, "Miss Emma, are you going to stay with us forever?" Emma glanced toward the doorway where James stood watching, his heart full of love for this woman who had healed his broken family. "Well," she said with a smile, "that depends on whether your daddy thinks you're stuck with me." James stepped into the room, kneeling beside the bed where his sons looked up at him with bright, hopeful faces. "Boys, how would you feel if Miss Emma became part of our family officially?" Benjamin clapped his hands together excitedly while Oliver threw his arms around Emma's neck. "Does that mean she'd be our new mummy?" Emma's eyes filled with happy tears as she looked at James. "I would be honored to love you both forever," she whispered. "Your mummy will always be special and irreplaceable, but there's room in our hearts for new love too." That night, as James and Emma stood together in the doorway watching their peacefully sleeping sons, he knew that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from medicine or therapy, but from the simple power of genuine love and patient care. Emma had given them more than peace. She had given them a future filled with hope and the promise of new happiness built on the foundation of healed hearts.